The Derelict was lot number 7412, and nobody wanted it. Mordan had been sitting in the auction house's upper gallery for 6 hours, his four hands folded across his broad chest, watching the liquidation of the Vrendel Defense Fleet's decommissioned assets scroll past on the main display. The Vrendel were a proud species, or they had been before the conglomerate absorbed their military into the standardized galactic peacekeeping framework. Now their warships were being sold for scrap, and the auction house on Station Argolis was doing a brisk business in hull plating, reactor cores, and weapon systems that a dozen smaller species would refit and resell across the frontier. Lot 7411, a Vrendel heavy cruiser, had just gone for 40,000 credits to a Cathari dismantling consortium. Lot 7413, a pair of orbital defense platforms, was generating heated bidding from 3 separate buyers. But Lot 7412 sat on the display like a forgotten chair at an estate sale, drawing nothing but silence from the audience. Mordan understood why. The image on the screen showed a ship that didn't look like much of anything. It was roughly the right shape for a warship, or it had been once, before something had torn most of its superstructure away. The hull was scarred and pitted, and entire sections were missing, revealing internal decks that had been exposed to vacuum for what the catalog estimated was between 3 and 4 centuries. The ship's designation was listed as unknown, human origin, pre-treaty era, and its assessed value was 1,200 credits, most of which came from the estimated mass of its remaining hull alloy. 1,200 credits. Mordan's repair bay on the lower levels of Argolis was 4 months behind on its lease payments. He had perhaps 2 weeks before the station's commerce authorities seized his equipment and auctioned it to cover the debt. 1,200 credits wouldn't solve his problems, but the hull alloy alone, if it was the high-grade titanium composite that human ships of that era typically used, would fetch 6 times that amount from any reputable recycler. He entered his bid on the personal terminal embedded in the armrest of his seat. 1,250 credits. A marginal increase over the assessed value that he hoped would be enough to secure a lot that no one else seemed interested in claiming. The auctioneer announced the bid with the flat professional tone of someone who had been selling decommissioned warships for 8 hours and had stopped caring about the particulars several lots ago. A countdown was initiated. 10 seconds for any competing bid. 8, 5, 3, sold. Mordan exhaled slowly through his nasal passages, a Velthari gesture of cautious relief that his mammalian associates often mistook for irritation. He downloaded the lot details to his personal data core and left the gallery before anyone could ask him why he had just spent money he didn't have on a ship that was, by any reasonable assessment, worthless. The Derelict was tethered to a maintenance spar in Argolis' outer docking ring, and Mordan's first sight of it in physical space did nothing to improve his opinion of his purchase. The catalog images had been generous. In person, the ship looked worse, a skeletal remnant of what had once been a substantial vessel, its hull breached in a dozen places, its engine section entirely gone, replaced by a ragged wound where something had torn the stern away with force that had left the remaining metal curled inward like the petals of a scorched flower. He flew his salvage tug alongside the wreck and ran a detailed scan. The results confirmed the catalog's estimates. The ship was old, very old. The radiation signature of its hull plating placed its last active period at approximately 370 years prior, which put it squarely in the era before the Sol Treaty, before humanity had been integrated into the galactic community, before they had become the Confederation's most unpredictable member species. It was from the time when humans had been alone in their corner of the galaxy, building ships and fighting wars and doing whatever they had done before the rest of the universe discovered them. The scan also confirmed something the catalog had only hinted at. The hull composition was unusual, not standard titanium composite. Something denser with a crystalline lattice structure that Mordan's materials database couldn't fully identify. The alloy was reading as approximately 40% heavier than expected for its volume, with thermal conductivity properties that suggested it had been designed to dissipate enormous amounts of energy very quickly. Armor, Mordan realized, this wasn't just hull plating. It was battleship armor, and it was of a quality he had never encountered in any human vessel from this era. The pre-treaty human ships he'd salvaged over the years had been competent but conventional, built with practical engineering that prioritized reliability over performance. This alloy was something else entirely. His interest, which had been purely financial, sharpened into something more professional. Mordan was a third-generation salvager, and while his business was failing, his instincts were not. You didn't survive 30 years in the salvage trade without learning to recognize when a wreck was hiding something beneath its surface. He docked his tug to the Derelict's largest accessible breach and suited up. The interior of the ship was dark and dead, exposed to vacuum for centuries, its compartments frozen in the state they had been in when the hull was breached. Mordan moved through the corridors with the careful efficiency of someone who had explored hundreds of wrecks, his suit's lamps cutting pale cones of light through the darkness. The ship had been gutted, not by the breach but deliberately. Panels had been removed, systems stripped, wiring pulled from conduits with a thoroughness that spoke to professional salvagers who had known exactly what they were looking for. The reactor compartment was empty. The weapons mounts were gone. The bridge was a shell, every console and display removed, leaving only the mounting brackets and the ghostly outlines where equipment had once been. But they hadn't gotten everything. Mordan found the first anomaly in what had been the ship's engineering section, a compartment near the center of the vessel that the original salvagers had either missed or been unable to access. A secondary bulkhead still sealed, made of the same dense alloy as the outer hull. It had no visible locking mechanism, no handle, no panel. It was just a wall, smooth and dark, set into the corridor like a door that had forgotten to become one. Mordan's suit scanner couldn't penetrate it. The alloy was too dense for standard scanning frequencies, and the surface reflected his probe in ways that suggested some kind of active shielding, which was impossible on a ship that had been dead for 3 centuries. He ran a thermal scan instead and found that the bulkhead was very slightly warmer than the surrounding hull. Not by much, a fraction of a degree, but in a ship that had been at the ambient temperature of deep space for 300 years, any heat at all was significant. Mordan stood in the dark corridor and stared at the sealed bulkhead and felt the particular tension that had driven him through 3 decades of salvage work. The moment of not knowing, the breath before the door opens. He had felt it on his first wreck, a broken freighter in the belt of a gas giant whose name he no longer remembered, when he'd found a cargo hold full of preserved Cathari artwork that had paid for his first repair bay. He had felt it 100 times since, and it had never gotten old, and it was the only thing in his life that still made him feel alive. He couldn't open the bulkhead, not with the equipment he had. He would need to return with cutting tools, and that meant spending money he didn't have on consumables he couldn't afford. The rational decision was to ignore the anomaly, strip the accessible hull plating, sell it to a recycler, pay his lease, and move on. Mordan placed his hand flat against the sealed bulkhead. Through his suit's glove, he could feel the faintest vibration. A hum, almost below the threshold of perception, rhythmic and steady. Something was running behind that wall. He returned to his tug and began making calls. The cutting equipment cost him 800 credits, which he didn't have, which he borrowed from a Velthari acquaintance named Tessock who charged interest rates that would have been criminal on any station with functional law enforcement. The plasma torch was a rental, old and temperamental, and it took Mordan 4 hours to set it up on the Derelict because the power draw kept tripping the tug's auxiliary circuits. But at 3 in the morning station time, on the second night after the auction, Mordan activated the torch and began cutting into the sealed bulkhead. The alloy resisted. The plasma torch, which could slice through standard hull plating in seconds, crawled through the dense material at a rate that made Mordan's heart sink. Sparks and molten metal flew in slow arcs in the vacuum, and the cut line glowed cherry red and then white as the torch struggled to penetrate. It took 40 minutes to cut a rectangle large enough for Mordan to fit through, and by the time he was done, the torch's consumable tip was destroyed and the tug's power systems were complaining loudly. He pushed the cut section through into the space beyond and shone his lamp inside. The chamber beyond the bulkhead was small, perhaps 4 meters square, and it was not dead. The walls were covered in a fine lattice of something that glowed with a faint blue luminescence, a quality that Mordan recognized from a handful of encounters with human biological technology. Not electric light, not chemical. something living, or at least something that mimicked life closely enough that the distinction didn't matter in practical terms. The chamber contained a single object, a pedestal roughly a meter high made of the same dark alloy as the bulkhead, and resting on it was a crystalline structure about the size of Mordan's upper hand. It was hexagonal, faceted, and it was glowing. Not with the faint blue of the walls, but with a deep, steady amber light that pulsed with the same rhythm as the vibration Mordan had felt through the bulkhead. A data core, not a conventional one. Mordan had seen human data cores from this era, clunky magnetic storage devices or early optical systems that held fractions of the data a modern crystal array could store. This was something else entirely. The crystal's lattice structure was too regular, too precise to be natural, and the amber light pulsing within it carried patterns that his suit's sensors registered as structured information, dense and complex beyond anything his analysis software could decode. He reached for it and stopped. The crystal was warm to the touch through his glove, and the pulse of its light seemed to quicken slightly as his hand approached, as if it were aware of his presence. Mordan was a salvager, not a superstitious being, but 30 years of exploring dead ships had taught him to trust his instincts when something felt like a boundary that shouldn't be crossed without understanding what lay on the other side. He pulled his hand back and spent the next 2 hours documenting the chamber with his suit's recording systems. He captured every angle of the crystal, every pattern in the walls, every reading his sensors could provide. Then he sealed the chamber as best he could with a patch kit from his suit's emergency supplies, and returned to his tug to think. The data he'd collected was, for all practical purposes, useless to him. The crystal's information patterns were encrypted in ways that his equipment couldn't begin to unravel, and the biological systems on the walls were unlike anything in his databases. He needed help. Specifically, he needed someone who understood human technology from the pre-treaty era, and he needed someone who could be trusted not to report what he'd found to the station authorities, who would seize the derelict and everything on it under the Confederation's antiquities laws if they learned that it contained anything of historical significance. Mordan knew exactly one person who fit both criteria. Her name was Sera Okafor, and she was a human. If you're finding this story as compelling as I hoped, take a quick moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. I really want to know what you think is inside that crystal, so drop your theories in the comments below. Now, let's get back to what Mordan found. Sera Okafor operated a technical consulting business from a cramped office on Argoles's middle decks, sandwiched between a Cathari food vendor and a shop that sold recreational pharmaceuticals to long-haul freighter crews. She was perhaps 40 years old by human standards, with close-cropped dark hair, steady hands, and the particular kind of tiredness that came from being very good at a job that didn't pay very well. She was also, as far as Mordan knew, the only human on Argoles who had the technical expertise to analyze pre-treaty human technology and the personal disposition to keep her mouth shut about what she found. She listened to Mordan's description without interrupting. When he finished, she leaned back in her chair and stared at the ceiling for a long time. "The vibration pattern," she said. "You said it was rhythmic. Can you describe it more precisely?" Mordan produced his suit's recording data and played the audio feed from his exterior sensors. In the vacuum of the derelict, there had been no sound, but the vibration had registered on the suit's contact sensors as a tactile pattern, and Sera had him convert it to an audio signal so she could hear it through her own ears. She listened to it once, then again, then a third time, and on the third repetition, her expression changed. Something moved behind her eyes, a recognition that Mordan couldn't identify, but that carried an emotional weight he could feel even across the species divide. "That's a heartbeat," she said quietly. Mordan waited. Sera pulled up a database on her terminal, a personal archive that Mordan suspected contained information she wasn't technically supposed to have, and cross-referenced the vibration pattern against something he couldn't see on her screen. "Not a literal heartbeat," she continued. "It's a timing signal, a clock pulse. Pre-treaty human military systems used a synchronization standard based on the average resting heart rate of a human adult, 72 beats per minute, It was used to coordinate multi-ship operations before we had access to Confederation time-sync protocols. She looked at him directly. Mordan, whatever is behind. That bulkhead is still running on military-spec timing. After 370 years, that's not possible with any technology I know of from that era. Then it's technology you don't know about, Mordan said. Sera gave him a look that humans reserved for people who stated the obvious. Apparently, she said. She stood and grabbed a jacket from the back of her chair. Take me to it. They went together in Mordan's tug, and Sera said nothing during the 20-minute flight to the outer docking ring. She stood at the viewport and watched the derelict grow larger, and Mordan noticed that her hands were clasped behind her back in a way that made her knuckles white. Inside the ship, she moved differently than Mordan had. Where he had been methodical and cautious, she was directed and purposeful, as if she knew where she was going even though she had never been on this vessel before. She led them through the gutted corridors without hesitation, past the stripped bridge and the empty reactor compartment, to the sealed bulkhead that Mordan had cut through. She examined the cut edges of the alloy with a small handheld scanner that she'd brought, running it along the molten scar where the plasma torch had burned through. She scanned the bioluminescent walls. She scanned the crystal on its pedestal, and the amber light pulsed more quickly as her scanner passed over it, and Mordan saw her lips move silently, forming words he couldn't hear through his translator. The crystal isn't a data core, she said finally. It's an interface, a communication device. Communicating with what? With whatever is still running on this ship. She turned to face him, and her expression had settled into something that Mordan could only describe as reverence. Mordan, I need to touch it, and I need you to record everything that happens when I do. He wanted to ask why. He wanted to ask what she expected to happen, what risks she was taking, what she knew that she wasn't telling him. But Sera was already removing her glove, and the look on her face left no room for negotiation. He activated his suit's recording systems. Sera placed her bare hand on the crystal. The amber light blazed. The bioluminescent walls flared from blue to white, and the chamber was flooded with light so bright that Mordan's suit visor auto-dimmed to its maximum setting. The vibration that had been a faint hum became a deep, resonant thrum that he felt in his bones, and the crystal's pulse shifted from its steady 72 beats per minute to something faster, more complex. A pattern that his suit's sensors registered as a cascading series of information exchanges, data flowing in both directions between the crystal and Sera's hand. Sera's eyes were closed. Her face was perfectly calm and tears were streaming down her cheeks. It lasted perhaps 30 seconds. Then the light faded, the vibration subsided, and the chamber returned to its previous state of quiet luminescence. Sera opened her eyes and withdrew her hand. She stood still for a moment, breathing deeply, and then she looked at Mordan with an expression that he would remember for the rest of his life. It said hello, she whispered. The ship's name was the Prometheus. Sera knew this because the crystal had told her, along with a great many other things that she spent the next 3 hours relating to Mordan in the cramped cockpit of his tug while they drifted alongside the derelict. She spoke slowly, occasionally pausing to organize her thoughts, and Mordan listened with the patience of a being who had learned over 30 years of salvage work that the most valuable things were never found quickly. The Prometheus had not been a conventional battleship. It had been built in 2147, during a period of human history that Sera referred to as the Sol Crisis, a conflict that had occurred before humanity's first contact with alien species, and that, according to the official histories taught in the Confederation's educational systems, had been a relatively minor internal dispute over resource allocation in the outer solar system. The crystal's version of events was different. The Sol Crisis had not been minor. It had been existential. Humanity had encountered something in the outer reaches of its own solar system, not an alien species but a phenomenon, an expanding region of altered space-time that Sera could only describe in terms that made Mordan's translator struggle with the concepts. The phenomenon consumed everything it touched, not by destroying it but by unmaking it, reducing matter and energy to a state that the crystal's records described as pre-structural, a condition in which the fundamental forces of the universe ceased to operate in ways that allowed complexity to exist. Humanity had fought the phenomenon for 11 years. They had thrown everything they had at it, weapons and theories and sacrifices beyond counting, and they had lost. Not quickly, but inexorably, the way any force loses against entropy I. Self, the Prometheus had been the last ship built to fight it, and it had not been built as a weapon. It had been built as an ark. The crystal was not a communication device in the conventional sense. It was the ship's central intelligence, an artificial consciousness that had been designed to preserve the sum of human knowledge and culture in the event that the phenomenon reached Earth. The Prometheus had been loaded with a complete archive of human civilization. Every piece of art, every scientific discovery, every philosophical work, every piece of music and literature and history that humanity had produced up to that point, compressed and encoded into the crystal's molecular lattice using technology that Sera said didn't exist in any known human database. The ship had been sent outward, away from the phenomenon, on a trajectory designed to carry it beyond the reach of the threat. Its mission had been to survive, to wait, and to one day make contact with whatever human civilization might emerge from the crisis, if any did. But something had happened. The crystal's records were incomplete, damaged by the centuries, but the fragments Sera could access suggested that the Prometheus had encountered the phenomenon despite its trajectory, had been damaged in the encounter, and had limped to this region of space, where it had been found and partially salvaged by unknown parties at some point in the intervening centuries. Those salvagers had stripped everything they could reach, but they had not found the crystal chamber, because the chamber had been designed to be invisible to standard scanning techniques, hidden behind the dense alloy bulkhead and the biological camouflage systems that still clung to its walls. The crystal had been waiting in the dark for 370 years, maintaining itself on trace energy, keeping its archive intact, pulsing at 72 beats per minute because that was the rhythm it had been built to keep, the rhythm of a human heart, the rhythm of the species it had been created to preserve. And when Sera touched it, it had recognized her, not as an individual, but as human. The biometric signature of her hand had been sufficient to trigger the crystal's interface protocol, and it had greeted her with a single word, transmitted not as sound, but as a direct neural impulse that she described as the most intimate and gentle communication she had ever experienced. Hello. Mordan sat in the pilot's seat and processed what Sera had told him. He was a salvager. He dealt in metal and components and the measurable value of decommissioned hardware. What Sera was describing was something else entirely, something that existed in the space between archaeology and theology, and he felt profoundly unequipped to evaluate it. What does it want? He asked. Sera wiped her face with the back of her hand. It wants to complete its mission. It wants to deliver the archive to humanity. It's been waiting for someone to take it home. Can the archive be removed from the ship? I don't think so. The crystal is integrated with the ship's structure at a molecular level. It can't be separated without destroying the data. The whole ship has to go. Mordan looked at the display showing the Derelict's battered hull. That ship can't go anywhere. It doesn't have engines, it doesn't have a reactor, it barely has a hull. Moving it would require a tow capacity that neither of us can afford. I know, Sera said. But Mordan, do you understand what's on that ship? It's not just data. The crystal contains the complete technological knowledge of an entire era of human civilization, an era that developed technologies we've lost, that we've never rediscovered, that the Confederation doesn't even know existed. The alloy in that bulkhead alone, if we could understand how it was made, would revolutionize half a dozen industries. And the archive itself, the art, the music, the literature, the science, it's the cultural heritage of an entire branch of human history that we thought was lost. Mordan understood. He understood the value, both practical and incalculable, of what Sera was describing, but understanding and doing were separated by a chasm of logistics and finance that he didn't know how to cross. We need help, he said. Not from the authorities, Sera said quickly. If the Confederation finds out about this, they'll classify it under the Cultural Heritage Protection Act and lock it away in a research facility where a committee will spend 50 years deciding who gets to look at it. The crystal has been waiting for 370 years. I don't want it to wait 50 more. Then who? Sera was quiet for a moment. There's a man on this station named Corwin Hale. He's a human freighter captain, independent operator, owns a ship called the Peregrine. He's got tow capacity and he owes me a favor. But Mordan, if we bring him in, we're trusting him with something that could reshape human civilization. I need to know if you're willing to take that risk. Mordan thought about his repair bay, about the lease payments, about the 30 years of work that had brought him to this moment. He thought about all the wrecks he'd salvaged, all the metal he'd recycled, all the small practical transactions that had defined his life. And he thought about the feeling he'd had when he'd first touched the sealed bulkhead, the vibration through his glove, the sense of something waiting on the other side. He'd spent his whole life taking things apart. Maybe it was time to put something together. Bring him, Mordan said. Corwin Hale was not what Mordan had expected. The freighter captains he'd dealt with over the years tended to fall into two categories, the desperate and the cynical. Hale was neither. He was a large man, perhaps 50 years old, with the weathered face of someone who had spent decades in space and the calm demeanor of someone who had learned that most emergencies resolved themselves if you gave them enough time and enough thrust. He listened to Sera's explanation without interrupting, asked exactly 3 questions, and then said, "When do we leave?" His ship, the Peregrine, was an old freighter that had been modified so extensively that its original configuration was unrecognizable. The cargo bay had been reinforced for heavy towing, the engines had been upgraded with surplus military propulsion units, and the navigation systems were a patchwork of components from a dozen different species, all integrated with a casual competence that suggested Hale was a better engineer than he let on. The tow took 3 days. Mordan rode on the Peregrine while Hale maneuvered the massive ship into position alongside the Derelict and attached magnetic clamps to the few sections of hull that were still structurally sound. The Prometheus was dead weight, and moving it put an enormous strain on the Peregrine's systems, but Hale handled the ship with a quiet skill that made the operation look routine. They were halfway to the jump point when the conglomerate patrol vessel appeared. It emerged from behind a debris field, its transponder identifying it as the Audacity, a fast-response patrol ship assigned to the Argolese sector. It hailed them on a standard channel, and Hale answered with the unhurried professionalism of a man who had been boarded before and had learned that the key to surviving such encounters was to appear as boring as possible. Independent freighter Peregrine, transponder shows you're towing a large object. Please identify the cargo. Salvage, Commander, Hale replied. Purchased at the Argolese liquidation auction, Lot 7412. Decommissioned hull, human origin, pre-treaty era, headed for the breakers at Vega Station. There was a pause. Mordan could see the patrol vessel on the Peregrine's external cameras, a sleek angular ship that dwarfed the Peregrine in both size and firepower. It was holding position approximately 2 kilometers away, and its sensor arrays were oriented directly at the Prometheus. Stand by, Peregrine. We're running a scan on your tow. Hale muted the comm and looked at Sera. How good is that camouflage system on the crystal chamber? It's designed to defeat standard scanning. It should hold, should. The system's been running on minimal power for 370 years. I can't guarantee anything. The scan took 7 minutes. Mordan watched the patrol vessel's sensor arrays cycle through frequencies, and he felt each one as a physical sensation in his chest, a tightening that grew more acute with each passing second. If the scan penetrated the bulkhead, if it detected the crystal, if it identified the archive, then everything they were trying to do would end in a classified seizure and a government research facility and 50 years of bureaucratic paralysis, while the phenomenon continued its slow expansion toward human space. The patrol vessel's comm crackled. Peregrine, your scan is clean. The tow matches the auction description. Decommissioned hull, no active systems, no contraband. You're clear to proceed. Stay on your filed flight plan. Hale unmuted his comm. Copy that, Audacity. Much obliged. Peregrine out. He turned to Sera and Mordan, and for the first time since Mordan had met him, Hale's comm cracked. A thin smile crossed his face there and gone, and his shoulders dropped a fraction of an inch. That was closer than I like, he said. They made the jump to human space without further incident. They emerged from jump space in the Sol system, and Mordan saw Earth for the first time. It was smaller than he'd expected, a blue and white sphere hanging in the darkness, and it was beautiful in a way that surprised him. He had seen thousands of worlds, had cataloged their features and assessed their resources and moved on because that was what a salvager did. But Earth was different, and the difference wasn't in its appearance but in what it meant. This was the world where the species that had built the Prometheus had been born. This was where the archive's knowledge had come from. This was home, not for Mordan, but for everything the crystal contained, and standing in the Peregrine's cargo bay and watching that small blue sphere through the external cameras, Mordan felt something he had never felt before. A kind of awe that wasn't about size or power or technology, but about the simple, staggering fact of existence. A species had arisen on that world, had looked up at the stars, and had built a ship to carry everything they were into the darkness, just in case the darkness came for them first. It was, he thought, the most audacious act of preservation he had ever encountered, and he had spent his life among people who preserved things. Hale navigated them to a point in the asteroid belt where he had contacts, people who could be trusted to keep quiet and who had the facilities to handle a damaged vessel of the Prometheus's size. The transfer was handled with minimal ceremony. The Derelict was docked in a hollowed-out asteroid that served as an independent repair facility, and Sera took charge of the operation with an authority that Mordan had not seen in her before. She was different now. Not just the tears or the reverent silences, but something deeper. She moved and spoke with a confidence that came from knowledge, from the crystal's archive flowing through her mind and giving her access to an understanding of technology that surpassed anything in the current human or Confederation databases. She directed the repair teams with precise instructions that they didn't fully understand, but that produced results they couldn't argue with. The Prometheus's hull was patched using techniques derived from the crystal's engineering data, methods of molecular bonding that produce seems stronger than the original alloy. A power system was fabricated, not a replica of the original reactor, but something simpler, something that the current state of human technology could build and that the crystal's interface could optimize. It took 6 weeks, and when it was done, the Prometheus was not restored. It was transformed, a hybrid of ancient design and modern capability, a ship that looked like a scarred veteran but that hummed with power that belied its appearance. The crystal's pulse had changed during the repair process. It was faster now, more complex, and Sera said that the interface had begun sharing not just knowledge but intent. The crystal, she said, had a mission that went beyond simply delivering the archive. It wanted to help. It wanted to take the knowledge it contained and use it to prepare humanity for what was coming. Because the phenomenon that the Prometheus had been built to fight was still out there. The crystal's records showed that the expanding region of altered spacetime had not stopped when the ship had fled. It had continued to grow slowly, steadily, consuming the outer reaches of human space, and then, as human civilization retreated and regrouped and eventually expanded in new directions, the phenomenon had followed. It was still out there, still expanding, still unmaking everything it touched, and it was closer to human space than anyone in the current era knew. The archive wasn't just a record of the past, it was a weapon for the future. The Prometheus had been built to carry it to safety, but its true purpose had always been to deliver it to a humanity that was ready to use it. And after 370 years of waiting, the crystal had decided that humanity was ready. Mordan didn't understand all of it. He was a salvager, not a scientist or a soldier or a philosopher. But he understood the shape of what was happening, the way you understand the shape of a story even when you don't know all the words. A forgotten ship bought for scrap by an alien who couldn't pay his bills had turned out to contain the accumulated knowledge of an entire era of human civilization and a warning about a threat that the current era didn't know existed. And the ship had chosen to reveal itself not to a government or a military or a research institution, but to a salvager, a consultant, and a freighter captain. 3 individuals who had stumbled into the middle of something that would change the shape of the galaxy. Sera came to find Mordan on the day the repairs were completed. She found him in the asteroid's observation deck, a small chamber with a viewport that looked out at the scattered rocks of the belt and the distant blue point of Earth. He was sitting with his 4 hands folded in his lap, watching the stars, and she sat down beside him. "The crystal wants to speak with you," she said. Mordan turned to look at her. "It can do that. It's been learning. From me, from the repair teams, from the data it's been accessing through the ship's new systems. It's been watching you, Mordan. It wants you to know something." He followed her to the Prometheus. The ship felt different now, alive in a way it hadn't been. And when he'd first cut through that bulkhead, The corridors were still dark, still damaged, but there was an energy in the air, a hum beneath the silence that made the ship feel less like a wreck and more like a sleeping animal waiting to wake. The crystal chamber was brighter than before. The bioluminescent walls glowed with a warm, steady light, and the crystal itself pulsed with an amber radiance that filled the room. Sera stopped at the entrance. "It won't hurt you," she said. "It just wants to connect." "Like it did with me. Will you let it?" Mordan thought about the moment he'd placed his hand on the sealed bulkhead and felt the vibration through his glove. He thought about the auction, the 1,200 credits, the desperate arithmetic of a failing business. He thought about 30 years of taking things apart and the strange, unfamiliar feeling of being part of putting something together. He removed his glove and placed his hand on the crystal. The connection was not what he'd expected. Sera had described an intimate emotional experience, a greeting that had moved her to tears. What Mordan experienced was different. The crystal didn't greet him, it showed him. He saw the Prometheus as it had been. Whole and gleaming, its hull a single seamless shell of the dense alloy, its engines burning with a blue-white flame that pushed it outward from a solar system that was dying. He saw the crew, hundreds of humans in uniforms that carried insignia he didn't recognize, moving through the ship with the purposeful urgency of people who knew they were running out of time. He saw the crystal being installed in its chamber, the biological systems being grown on the walls, the bulkhead being sealed. He saw the moment the ship had encountered the phenomenon, not as a visual image but as a sensation, a feeling of wrongness that made his mind's recoil. Space itself warping and folding and coming undone, the fundamental structure of reality dissolving, and the Prometheus turning and running, its engines screaming, its hull groaning, its crew silent at their stations because there was nothing to say to something that was not an enemy but an ending. He saw the damage, the torn stern, the dead systems. The long, slow drift through empty space while the crystal kept its vigil in the dark, pulsing at 72 beats per minute, maintaining the archive, waiting for a human hand to touch it and complete the mission. And then the crystal showed him something else. It showed him the auction house on Argales. It showed him sitting in the upper gallery, his four hands folded across his chest, watching the lots scroll past. It showed him entering his bid, 1,250 credits. And it showed him why. The crystal had been aware, in its limited way, of the salvage operations that had stripped the Prometheus over the centuries. It had felt each intrusion, each removed component, each violation of the ship it had been built to protect. And it had learned to hide, to dim its signature, to become invisible to the sensors of beings who wanted only to take. It had been doing this for so long that it had become fundamental to its operating protocol. But when Mordan's scan had touched the sealed bulkhead, something different had happened. The crystal had felt the scan not as an intrusion but as a question, not as a taking but as a searching. And it had recognized in the pattern of Mordan's sensor sweep the signature of a being who was not trying to extract value but to understand what was there. The crystal had let itself be found, not because Mordan was special, not because he was human, but because he was curious. Because he had felt the vibration through the bulkhead and chosen to investigate rather than exploit. Because he had stood in the dark corridor and placed his hand on the wall and listened to the heartbeat of a ship that had been waiting for someone who would listen. The connection faded. Mordan withdrew his hand. The crystal's amber pulse was steady, calm, and he understood now that it was not just a data storage device or a communication interface. It was a mind. Not a human mind, but a mind that had been built by humans, that had been charged with preserving everything they were, and that had spent 370 years in the dark alone, maintaining its vigil with a patience that bordered on the incomprehensible. "Thank you," Mordan said quietly. He wasn't sure if the crystal could hear him without the direct connection, but it seemed right to say it anyway. The pulse quickened, just for a moment, just by a single beat. And then it returned to its steady rhythm, and Mordan knew that it had heard. The weeks that followed were the most extraordinary of Mordan's life, though he would never be the center of the story that the galaxy eventually told. That story belonged to Sera, who became the crystal's primary interface and who spent months translating the archive's technical data into forms that human science would use. It belonged to the researchers and engineers who, working from the knowledge the crystal provided, developed new materials, new energy systems, new theoretical frameworks that pushed the boundaries of what humanity thought was possible. It belonged to the military strategists who used the crystal's records of the phenomenon to develop defensive systems that could slow its expansion and eventually push it back. It belonged to humanity, which received the gift that the Prometheus had carried across the centuries and did what humanity had always done with gifts. It used them. Not wisely, not always, not without conflict and disagreement and the messy, inefficient processes that characterized every human endeavor. But it used them, and the phenomenon that had nearly destroyed human civilization once was met, 370 years later, by a humanity that was stronger and more capable and more determined than it had ever been, armed with knowledge that its ancestors had sacrificed everything to preserve. Mordan's role in all of this was small, and he knew it. He had bought a ship for scrap. He had cut through a bulkhead. He had brought Sera to the crystal and Corwin Hale to the ship, and he had made the choice to trust them both with something that could have made him wealthy beyond imagination if he'd sold it to the right buyer. He hadn't sold it. He'd given it away, freely and completely, because the crystal had shown him something in that brief moment of connection that had changed the way he saw himself and his place in the universe. The crystal had waited 370 years, not for a hero or a leader or a brilliant scientist, but for someone curious enough to look and patient enough to listen. And that someone had been a Velthari salvager with 4 hands and a failing business and 30 years of nothing to show for his work except a knack for finding things that other people had missed. The Prometheus was restored fully and completely, using the crystal's engineering data and the resources of the human colonies. It became a flagship, not of a military fleet but of a new kind of human endeavor, a ship that carried the archive's knowledge outward into the galaxy, sharing it with any species that wanted to learn. The crystal remained at its heart, pulsing at 72 beats per minute, the heartbeat of a species that had nearly been erased and had chosen instead to endure. Mordan visited the ship once more after it was fully restored and before its first voyage. He stood in the crystal chamber, which was now bright and warm and alive with the bioluminescent systems that covered every surface, and he placed his hand on the crystal one final time. The connection was brief. An image, a feeling, a single thought that was not quite language but that carried meaning with perfect clarity. "Thank you for finding me." Mordan stood in the heart of a ship that had changed galactic history and let the feeling wash through him. He was not a hero, he was not a leader. He was a salvager, a being who had spent his life picking through the wreckage of other people's ambitions. But in the wreckage of a forgotten human battleship, he had found something that no one else had thought to look for, and he had chosen to let it change the world. 1,250 credits for the accumulated knowledge of an entire civilization and the future of a species. Even by Velthari standards, that was a bargain.